The council hall went silent the moment Marcus opened his mouth, and Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet before he even finished the sentence. Every eye in the room turned toward her, waiting to see how the Luna would react to being told, in front of 40 pack members, that her mate had never loved her. She did not cry. She did not scream. She stood there in her green dress, the one she had chosen that morning, because Marcus once said it matched her eyes. And she listened to him explain that the bond between them had confused instinct for affection. He said the words carefully, as if he had practiced them, as if he needed them to sound final, so that nobody would question him further. Elena watched his jaw tighten with every syllable, and some small part of her noticed that his hands were shaking, but she pushed that thought away. A man does not shake when he is finally telling the truth. He shakes when he is lying about something enormous. The beta, a broad-shouldered man named Daniel, stepped forward to say something, but Elena raised a hand before he could speak. She did not want comfort. She did not want an explanation shouted across a room full of people who would repeat every word of it before sundown. She wanted to leave with whatever dignity she had left, and so she turned on her heel and walked out through the tall wooden doors, her footsteps steady on the stone floor even though her chest felt like it had been cracked open. Outside, the night air hit her face, and she finally allowed herself to breathe. The pack house stood at the edge of a wide territory, surrounded by pine trees that swayed gently under a sky full of stars, indifferent to the fact that her whole world had just been rearranged. She walked past the training yard, past the fountain, where he had once told her she was the only person who made him feel like the ground was solid, and she did not stop until she reached her own private cottage at the far end of the property, the one she had insisted on keeping even after the marriage, because some instinct in her had always known she might need a place that was only hers. She locked the door behind her and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without moving. By morning, Elena had made a decision. She was not going to beg him to explain himself, and she was not going to let the pack watch her fall apart. She called a locksmith from the nearest town, a young man named Peter, who did not ask questions when she told him to change every lock in the cottage by noon. She told the pack's head of staff that she wanted no visitors, and she told the kitchen she would be taking her meals alone. Word moved through the pack the way it always did, quiet and fast, and by evening everyone knew that the Luna had shut her door to the Alpha. Marcus heard about it from Daniel, who delivered the news carefully, watching his Alpha's face for a reaction that never fully came. Marcus only nodded, said that it was expected, and went back to the papers on his desk, as though nothing had happened. But later that night, alone in his study, he sat with his head in his hands for almost an hour, replaying the words he had said in the council hall, wondering if there had been another way to protect her that did not require breaking her heart to do it. He told himself this was necessary. He told himself that a threat had been made against Elena just 3 days earlier, delivered by a courier from a rival pack, with a message so specific that Marcus had not slept since reading it. The message named her, described her routine, and made clear that as long as she was seen as his weakness, she would remain a target. Severing the bond publicly, declaring that he felt nothing for her, was the only way Marcus could think to make her disappear from that danger. If the world believed the Alpha did not love his Luna, then hurting her would no longer be a way to hurt him. It was, in his mind, the only shield he could offer her without telling her the truth and putting the knowledge, and the danger that came with it, directly into her hands. But knowing his reasons did not make the plan feel any less cruel. He had watched her face crumble for exactly 1 second before she mastered it, and that single second replayed itself over and over in his mind until he could not sit still any longer. That was how Marcus found himself, just after midnight, walking the long path toward Elena's cottage, without any clear plan of what he intended to do when he arrived. He told himself he only wanted to make sure she was safe, that a quick pass by her window would settle his nerves enough to let him sleep. But when he reached the edge of her garden, he stopped. The cottage was dark, except for a single lamp glowing behind the curtains of her bedroom window, and the sight of that small light undid something in him. He could not bring himself to knock. He could not bring himself to leave either. At the back of the garden stood a small wooden shed where Elena kept her gardening tools, a place she had built herself 2 summers earlier when she decided she wanted to grow her own vegetables instead of relying on the pack's kitchen garden. Marcus had visited it exactly once, on the day she proudly showed him the tomato plants she had started from seed. He remembered how her hands had been covered in soil, how she had laughed when he tried to help and instead knocked over a tray of seedlings. He pushed open the shed door and stepped inside. It smelled of cedar and damp earth. There was a folded tarp in the corner, and he sat on it, telling himself he would only stay a few minutes. He did not leave until morning. The cold crept into his bones long before dawn, and by the time the sky began to lighten, his back ached from the awkward position he had slept in against a shelf of clay pots. He woke with a start, disoriented, and for one confused moment, he forgot why he was in a wooden shed instead of his own bed. Then the memory of the council hall came rushing back, and with it, the shame of what he had done, and the strange comfort of being close to her, even though she did not know it. He left before the sun fully rose, slipping out through the garden gate and back toward the pack house, careful to avoid the early risers who tended the stables. He told himself this would not happen again. He told himself he had proven whatever he needed to prove to himself, and that tonight he would sleep in his own bed like a rational man. But that evening, as darkness settled over the territory, Marcus found his feet carrying him down the same path once more. Inside the cottage, Elena spent the day trying to convince herself that she was fine. She scrubbed the kitchen counters until they shone, reorganized her bookshelf by color instead of author, and forced herself to eat a full breakfast, even though her stomach felt tight and unwilling. She was determined not to let the events of the previous night define the rest of her life. She had built a life before Marcus, and she reminded herself, again and again, that she was capable of building one after him too. Still, there were moments when the memory of his voice saying those words caught her off guard, striking her in the middle of ordinary tasks like folding laundry or watering the plants on her windowsill. In those moments, she had to stop and press her palm flat against the nearest solid surface until the wave passed. She did not know, as she moved through her quiet day, that the man who had broken her heart was, at that very moment, avoiding sleep in his own quarters and pacing the length of his study, glancing again and again toward the window that faced the direction of her cottage. Around the pack house, the whispers had already begun to take shape. Some said the alpha had grown cold because Elena had failed to give him an heir quickly enough. Others said she had been unfaithful, though nobody could name with whom, because the rumor existed only to fill a silence that made people uncomfortable. A few of the older pack members, the ones who had known Marcus since he was a boy trailing behind his father, refused to believe any explanation at all, insisting there was more to the story than anyone had been told. Daniel, who had grown up alongside Marcus and considered himself closer to him than anyone else in the pack, tried twice that day to get a straight answer out of his alpha. Both times, Marcus gave him nothing beyond a tired stare and a request to focus on border patrols instead of gossip. Daniel let it go, though the worry did not leave his chest. He had seen Marcus angry before, and he had seen him grieving before, after the loss of his father 2 years earlier. This was different. This looked like a man carrying something too heavy to set down, and refusing every offered hand that might have helped him carry it. By the second night, Marcus arrived at the shed earlier, bringing with him a folded wool blanket he had taken from a storage closet near the training hall. He told himself this was the last time. He told himself that once he confirmed there had been no further threats against her, he would stop this pattern and find another way to keep watch over her, from a distance that did not require trespassing in her garden. He settled onto the tarp again, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and listened to the quiet sounds of the cottage. Once, near midnight, he heard Elena's footsteps cross the kitchen floor, followed by the soft clink of a kettle being filled. He held his breath without meaning to, as though she might somehow hear him breathing through the wooden walls, though he knew that was impossible. The footsteps retreated. The light in the kitchen window went dark a while later. Marcus finally allowed himself to close his eyes. He woke twice during the night from dreams he could not fully remember, dreams that left him with the specific ache of having lost something enormous, though in each one, the details slipped away before he could hold on to them. Each time, he opened his eyes to the same dim outline of gardening tools hanging on the shed wall, and each time, he reminded himself why he had chosen this strange, uncomfortable exile instead of the comfort of his own bed. Somewhere out there, a rival pack believed the bond between the Alpha and his Luna had been broken. As long as that belief held, Elena was safer than she had been in weeks. The cost of that safety, Marcus told himself, was worth carrying alone, even if it meant sleeping on a hard wooden floor, surrounded by empty flower pots and the lingering scent of soil. What he did not yet understand was how difficult it would be to keep this a secret. A pack full of wolves possessed senses sharper than any ordinary community, and even the most careful movements left traces that patient eyes would eventually notice. Somewhere in the days ahead, someone was going to find the folded blanket, or catch his scent lingering too long near a garden that was not his own, and when that happened, there would be no simple explanation left to offer. For now, though, the shed remained his secret, and the distance between the Alpha and his Luna remained exactly 9 feet of grass and 1 wooden door, close enough that he could hear her move through her nights, and far enough that she had no idea he was there at all. Grace, the pack's oldest healer, noticed the change in Marcus before anyone else did. She had tended his scrapes as a boy, and his wounds as a man, and she knew the particular tiredness that came from a fight in the body, and she knew this was not that kind of tiredness. On the 3rd morning after the council hall, she found him standing outside the medicine room, with dirt on the knee of his trousers and pine needles caught in his hair, and she said nothing except to hand him a cup of tea and tell him to sit down before he fell down. Marcus drank the tea without arguing, which told Grace more than any words could have. He had always been a man who resisted being cared for, insisting he was fine even when he clearly was not, and the fact that he sat quietly and let her fuss over a small cut on his palm meant that something inside him had cracked open in a way he could not fully hide anymore. "You look like a man who has not slept in his own bed," Grace said, not as a question. Marcus set the cup down carefully. "I have things on my mind. Everyone in this pack has things on their mind." Most of them still managed to sleep somewhere warm. She studied him a moment longer, her sharp eyes taking in the state of his boots, still damp from morning grass. "Whatever you are doing, Marcus, be careful. Wolves talk. Even when they think they are being quiet, they talk." He did not answer her directly, but her words stayed with him through the rest of the day, a warning he could not quite bring himself to heed. Meanwhile, Elena had begun to notice small things around her cottage that did not sit right. A garden trowel that she was certain she had left on the workbench was instead resting on the floor. The shed door, which she always latched, was found unlatched 2 mornings in a row. At first, she assumed it was the wind, or perhaps a fox that had wandered in looking for shelter, but on the 3rd morning, she found something that made her stomach tighten in a way she could not immediately explain. Folded neatly in the corner of the shed, beside the stacked clay pots, was a wool blanket she did not recognize. It was not one of hers. She lifted it carefully, running her fingers over the rough fabric, and caught a scent that made her breath catch in her throat before she could stop it. She knew that scent. She had known it for 3 years, had fallen asleep beside it more nights than she could count, had once thought she would know it for the rest of her life. She stood in the doorway of her own shed for a long moment, the blanket clutched in her hands, torn between anger and something far more complicated that she refused to name. Part of her wanted to march to the pack house and demand to know what he thought he was doing, skulking around her property after declaring in front of the entire pack that he felt nothing for her. Another part of her, quieter and more cautious, told her to wait, to watch, to understand the shape of whatever this was before she reacted. In the end, she chose silence. She folded the blanket back exactly as she had found it, and left the shed without touching anything else. But that night, she made sure to lock the door with a heavier padlock, one that required a key rather than a simple latch, and she told herself this was about principle and not about wanting to see what he would do next. Marcus arrived that evening to find the shed locked against him. He stood in the dark garden for a long time, staring at the small padlock glinting faintly under the moonlight, and something in his chest sank lower than he thought possible. He understood the message clearly enough. She had found him out, or found evidence of him, and she had responded the only way that made sense to a woman who had been publicly humiliated by the man standing in front of her locked shed. He almost turned and walked away for good that night. He almost convinced himself that this was a sign, that he should abandon the whole reckless plan and find some other way to watch over her from a distance, that did not require breaking into her private space. But the memory of the courier's message, the specific details about her morning walks and her favorite path through the eastern woods, kept his feet rooted to the spot. He circled the small building slowly, running his hand along the wooden slats until he found a loose panel near the back, one that Elena herself had never noticed, because she rarely looked at the shed from that angle. He pried it open just enough to slip through, careful not to splinter the wood any further than it already was, and settled onto the same tarp as before, though without the comfort of his blanket this time. The following morning, Elena discovered the loose panel and understood immediately what it meant. He had found a way in, despite her lock. Rather than feeling triumphant that her defenses had failed, she felt something closer to unwilling curiosity, a question forming in the back of her mind that she was not ready to ask out loud. Why would a man who claimed to feel nothing for her go to such trouble just to sleep on the floor of her garden shed? She decided, against every instinct that told her to demand answers immediately, to say nothing. If he wanted to explain himself, he would have every opportunity to do so. Until then, she would continue her days exactly as she had planned them, refusing to let his strange behavior pull her back into a conversation she was not ready to have. Word of the locked shed and the loose panel eventually reached Daniel, though not through Marcus directly. One of the younger pack members, a sharp-eyed boy named Ethan, who helped tend the grounds, mentioned in passing that he had noticed fresh scuff marks near the back of the Luna's shed, and that the wood looked recently disturbed. Daniel filed the information away without comment, but that night, curiosity got the better of him, and he took a slow walk past the edge of Elena's garden, under the guise of checking the perimeter fence. He caught Marcus's scent immediately, faint but unmistakable, lingering near the shed, in a way that told him exactly what his old friend had been doing every night for the better part of a week. Daniel did not confront him. He simply stood at the edge of the tree line for a long moment, turning the discovery over in his mind, and then walked back toward the pack house with far more questions than he had arrived with. The following day, Daniel found Marcus in the training yard, going through a set of exercises with far more force than the drill required, his knuckles raw from strikes against the wooden post. Daniel waited until the session ended before speaking. "You want to tell me why you're sleeping in the Luna's garden shed?" he said, keeping his voice low enough that only Marcus would hear it. Marcus did not stop wrapping the cloth around his knuckles. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your scent is all over that shed, Marcus. I've known you since we were children. Don't insult me by pretending." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing at all, his jaw working as though he were chewing on words he could not decide whether to release. Finally, he exhaled slowly and looked up at his old friend. "If I tell you why, you cannot repeat it. Not to anyone, not even to keep me from doing something you think is foolish." Daniel's expression sharpened with concern. "That bad?" "Worse," Marcus said quietly, and for the first time since the council hall, something in his composed exterior seemed to genuinely crack. "There's a threat against her, Daniel. A real one. And I don't know any other way to protect her that doesn't require putting the truth into her hands, where it could get her killed if the wrong person ever found out she knew." Daniel's face went pale as the pieces began to fall into place. "The declaration in the hall, that wasn't about your feelings at all." "No," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was never about that." The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the secret settling heavily between them. Daniel wanted to ask a dozen questions at once, wanted to demand details about the threat, and who had made it, and why Marcus had not brought it to the full council instead of carrying it alone, but something in his friend's exhausted expression told him this was not the moment to push further. "You should have told me sooner," Daniel finally said. "I should have told her sooner," Marcus corrected, glancing in the direction of Elena's cottage, though it was not visible from where they stood. "But every time I think about doing it, I remember what happens if I'm wrong about how well she can hide what she knows. I remember what happens to her if the wrong person even suspects she's aware of the danger." Daniel studied him for a long moment, seeing clearly now the shape of the burden his friend had chosen to carry entirely alone. "Then let me help you carry it," he said finally. "At the very least, let me watch the borders more closely. If there's a real threat out there, we need eyes on it, beyond just you losing sleep in a garden shed." Marcus nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders for the first time in days. It was not the full truth reaching Elena, not yet, but it was one less person carrying the weight entirely alone, and for now, that would have to be enough. That night, when Marcus returned to the shed, he found the loose panel had been repaired, the wood nailed firmly back into place. For a moment, his heart sank, certain that Elena had finally shut him out for good. But then he noticed something tucked just beneath the shed's small window, out of sight from the main path through the garden. It was the same wool blanket he had left behind, folded neatly, waiting for him exactly where he would find it, and nowhere anyone else might. He stood staring at it for a long time before he understood what it meant. She knew. She had known for days. And instead of turning him away completely, she had chosen, without a single word exchanged between them, to leave him away back in. 3 weeks had passed since the council hall, and the pack had settled into an uneasy rhythm around the strange arrangement between their Alpha and Luna, even if most of them did not know the true shape of it. Elena had returned to her regular duties, overseeing the distribution of supplies to the outer farms and organizing the autumn festival that the pack held every year at the turning of the season. She moved through her days with a composure that impressed everyone who watched her, though those closest to her could see the effort it cost. Hannah, a young woman who worked in the pack kitchens and had grown fond of Elena over the years, was one of the few who noticed the change in her Luna's habits. Elena had always been an early riser, but now she rose even earlier, often before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, and she took her morning tea alone in the garden instead of joining the small circle of women who usually gathered near the kitchen entrance. Hannah assumed this was simply grief, finding its own private shape, and she respected the distance without asking questions. What Hannah did not know, and what Elena had not told a single living soul, was that those early mornings had become the only time of day when Elena allowed herself to think clearly about the blanket still folded in the corner of her shed, and about the man who continued, night after night, to return to that small wooden space despite every obstacle she had quietly placed in his way. She had not confronted him. She told herself this was patience, though some nights it felt more like cowardice, dressed up in a calmer word. She wanted to understand what she was seeing before she reacted to it, because reacting too quickly, she reasoned, would only give him the chance to offer an explanation crafted specifically to smooth things over, and she was done accepting explanations that were designed more to comfort the person giving them than the person receiving them. Instead, she watched. She noted that he never entered before midnight, always waiting until the cottage lights had gone dark, as though he did not want to risk catching even a glimpse of her through the window. She noted that he never left a single trace inside her home itself, staying strictly within the boundary of the shed, never once attempting to approach the cottage door. And she noted, with a confusion that unsettled her more than anything else, that some part of her had started listening for the soft sound of the garden gate each night, waiting to hear whether he would come. On the 22nd night, a sound different from his usual quiet arrival woke her from a light sleep. It was sharper, more hurried, followed by a low sound that might have been pain quickly muffled. Elena sat up in bed, every instinct telling her something was wrong. She pulled a robe over her nightgown and moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains toward the dark shape of the garden. She could see very little in the darkness, but she could hear enough to know that whatever had happened, it had happened near the shed. Her heart pounded as she debated whether to investigate or to stay locked safely inside, and in the end, the same instinct that had once made her fall for Marcus in the first place, the instinct that refused to let fear make decisions for her, pushed her toward the door. She crossed the garden barefoot, the cool grass damp beneath her feet, and found Marcus leaning against the outer wall of the shed, one hand pressed to his side, his breathing ragged. In the dim moonlight she could see a dark stain spreading across his shirt, and for one terrifying moment, every carefully maintained wall she had built around herself over the past 3 weeks came crashing down at once. "What happened to you?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended, fear making it come out harsher than the concern she actually felt. Marcus looked up at her, clearly startled to find her standing there, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Then he straightened, wincing, and tried to wave off her concern, with a hand that shook too badly to be convincing. "It's nothing. A patrol encounter near the eastern border. I'm fine." "You are clearly not fine," Elena said, already moving closer, despite every warning bell in her mind telling her not to get involved. "Let me see it." "Elena, let me see it, Marcus, or I will call for Grace right now and let the whole pack know exactly where you've been spending your nights." That threat was enough to make him go still. He allowed her to pull his shirt aside, revealing a deep gash along his ribs, still bleeding steadily despite whatever crude attempt he had made to bind it with a strip torn from his sleeve. Elena's breath caught at the sight of it, and any pretense of cool distance she had been maintaining evaporated entirely. "Inside," she said firmly, already moving to support his weight. "Now." He hesitated only a moment before allowing her to guide him through the garden and into the cottage, the very place he had refused to approach for 3 weeks, despite sleeping only a few feet away from it every single night. Inside, under the warm light of her kitchen lamp, Elena worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound with practiced hands, grateful that Grace had taught her enough basic healing skills over the years to handle a situation like this without panic. Neither of them spoke much during the process. The silence filled instead with the quiet sounds of cloth and water, and Marcus's occasional sharp intake of breath when she pressed too firmly against the wound. But when the bleeding had finally slowed and she was winding a clean bandage around his ribs, she could not stop herself from asking the question that had been building inside her for 3 weeks. "Why are you sleeping in my shed, Marcus?" He did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on some point on the kitchen floor as though the answer might be written there. When he finally looked up at her, his expression carried none of the cold detachment he had worn in the council hall. Instead, there was something raw and unguarded in his face, something she had not seen from him in a very long time. "Because I couldn't stay away," he said quietly, "even when I told myself I should." Elena's hands stilled on the bandage. "That's not an answer to what you said in that hall." "I know." He closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering strength for something difficult. "And I can't give you the full answer yet, Elena, not because I don't want to, because giving it to you right now could put you in more danger than you're already in." "Danger," she repeated, her voice tight. "What danger?" He shook his head, jaw clenched. "Please. I need you to trust me a little longer. I know I have given you no reason to, after everything I said in front of the entire pack. But I am asking anyway." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of the deception she had convinced herself she was seeing that first terrible night. What she found instead was exhaustion, worry lines that had not been there a month earlier, and something that looked unmistakably like fear, though not fear for himself. She finished tying off the bandage and stepped back, putting a careful distance between them, even in the small kitchen. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted honestly. "You cannot ask me to trust a man who stood in front of our entire pack and told everyone he never loved me, and then expect me to simply accept that there is a secret reason behind it that I am not allowed to know." "I'm not asking you to forgive it," Marcus said, his voice rough. "I'm asking you to survive it with me until I can explain everything properly. That's all I'm asking." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marcus began to fear she would order him out of her home entirely, back into the cold garden where he belonged according to every rule the last 3 weeks had established between them. But Elena, after a long moment of staring at him with an expression he could not fully read, finally spoke. "You can stay until the wound closes properly. On the couch, not the shed." It was not forgiveness. It was not even close to trust, but it was more than he had allowed himself to hope for since the moment he had stood in that council hall and watched her walk away from him without a single tear falling in front of anyone but herself. Marcus stayed on the couch for exactly 3 nights, the length of time Grace insisted was necessary, before a wound like his could be trusted to close without reopening under strain. Elena kept her distance during those 3 days, offering only what basic care was required, and retreating to her bedroom each evening without lingering conversation. But something had shifted between them, something neither of them acknowledged directly, though both felt its presence in the careful way they now moved around each other, no longer strangers, but not yet anything close to what they had been before. On the 4th morning, with the wound closed enough that Grace declared him fit to return to his own quarters, Marcus folded the blanket Elena had given him and set it neatly on the arm of the couch. He lingered by the door longer than necessary, clearly working up to say something, and Elena, drying a teacup in the kitchen, watched him from the corner of her eye without turning around. "Thank you," he said finally. "For the last 3 nights. I know I didn't deserve the kindness." Elena set the teacup down carefully. "I didn't do it for you," she said, though the words came out less sharp than she intended. "I did it because I couldn't in good conscience let a man bleed out in my garden, regardless of what he said about me in front of the entire council." "Fair enough," Marcus said, and there was the faintest hint of something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. He left that morning, and Elena assumed, with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment she refused to examine too closely, that the strange chapter of the garden shed had finally come to its natural end. But that night, well past midnight, she heard the familiar creak of the garden gate, and when she looked out her window, she saw him crossing the grass toward the shed, exactly as he had every night for the past 3 weeks. She did not confront him again. Some part of her had stopped expecting him to stay away, and an even quieter part of her, one she was not ready to admit existed, had started to feel something close to comfort in the knowledge that he was there, close enough to reach if something ever went wrong again in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, the danger that had driven Marcus to the council hall in the first place had not disappeared simply because he wished it away. The rival pack, led by a cold and calculating alpha named Simon, had grown bolder in the weeks since the courier delivered his warning. Scouts had been spotted twice along the eastern border, moving with a deliberate carelessness that suggested they wanted to be seen, wanted the pack to understand that their territory was being watched. Daniel, true to his word, had increased patrols along the border, doubling the number of wolves stationed near the tree line each night. He reported his findings to Marcus each morning, the two of them poring over maps in the study long before the rest of the pack house had woken. It was during one of these early conversations that Daniel finally raised the question that had been sitting unspoken between them for days. "How long do you plan to keep this from the full council?" Daniel asked, watching Marcus trace a line along the eastern ridge with a tired finger. "The longer you carry this alone, the more exhausted you become, and an exhausted alpha is not what this pack needs if Simon decides to test our borders properly instead of just scouting them." "I know," Marcus admitted, "but if I bring it to the council, it becomes common knowledge within a day. You know how fast information moves through this pack. And if Simon learns that we know about his interest in Elena specifically, he may accelerate whatever plan he currently has, instead of continuing to simply watch and wait. So instead, you exhaust yourself sleeping in a garden shed every night, protecting a woman who doesn't even fully understand why you're doing it." Marcus's jaw tightened at the observation, though he did not deny the truth of it. "What would you have me do differently, Daniel? Tell her everything and risk her reacting in a way that draws even more attention to the fact that the bond isn't truly broken? Or continue as I am, uncomfortable and exhausted, but keeping her safely in the dark until I find a way to neutralize the threat properly?" Daniel had no easy answer to offer, and the conversation drifted instead toward practical matters, additional scouts to place along the ridge, a possible alliance with a neighboring pack that had no love for Simon's ambitions either. But the underlying tension remained unresolved, a problem that grew heavier with each passing day, that Marcus refused to bring it fully into the light. Elena, unaware of the specifics being discussed in that study each morning, had begun to notice other small signs that something larger than a simple lover's dispute was unfolding around her. Patrols passed her cottage more frequently now, wolves in their human forms nodding politely as they walked the perimeter at hours when patrols had never bothered to come this close to the private residences before. When she asked one of the younger patrol members about the change, he grew visibly nervous and gave her only a vague answer about routine adjustments before hurrying off in the opposite direction. She raised the question with Marcus one night, when she found him sitting at the edge of the garden instead of already inside the shed, staring out at the dark tree line with an expression she could not quite name. "The patrols have changed," she said, settling onto the garden bench a careful distance away from him. "They pass my cottage now several times a night. That never used to happen." Marcus did not turn to look at her immediately. "Just being careful," he said, the same vague deflection the young patrol member had offered. "Careful of what, exactly?" "Elena," his voice carried a warning edge, though it was gentler than she expected. "Please don't push this right now. She studied his profile in the moonlight, the tension visible in the line of his shoulders even from a distance. Whatever burden he was carrying, it was clearly growing heavier by the day, and despite every reason she had to keep her distance from him, she found she could not simply walk away and leave him sitting alone in the dark with whatever weight was pressing down on him. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said finally, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice. "But you don't have to sit out here alone either." Marcus turned to look at her then, something vulnerable flickering across his face before he could hide it away again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with 3 weeks of unspoken tension and a fragile, uncertain warmth that neither was ready to name out loud. "Thank you," he said finally, and this time, when he retreated to the shed that night, Elena found herself standing at her window a little longer than usual, watching the small building until the last light beneath the door finally went dark. By the 5th week, Elena had decided she was done waiting for answers to arrive on their own. She was not a woman who had ever been content to sit quietly while decisions were made around her. And the longer Marcus refused to explain the increased patrols and the tension that seemed to follow him everywhere, the more determined she became to find out the truth herself. She started with Hannah, whose position in the kitchens meant she overheard far more pack gossip than anyone gave her credit for. Over tea one afternoon, Elena asked carefully worded questions about any unusual talk among the patrol wolves, and Hannah, sensing the seriousness behind the casual tone, admitted that she had heard whispers of a name mentioned more than once in hurried conversations near the kitchen entrance. The name was Simon. Elena had heard the name before, years earlier, during a tense negotiation between the packs over shared hunting grounds along the northern ridge. She remembered Marcus returning from that meeting with a grim expression, saying little about what had transpired, except that Simon was a man who valued power more than peace, and that dealing with him required constant vigilance. Armed with that single name, Elena went next to the pack archives, a quiet room at the back of the main hall where records of territorial disputes and correspondence with neighboring packs were carefully filed. She spent an afternoon there under the pretense of organizing materials for the upcoming autumn festival, using the time instead to search through recent correspondence for any mention of Simon or his pack. She found what she was looking for tucked inside a folder that had clearly been handled recently, the edges worn from repeated opening. It was a copy of a message, the original apparently kept elsewhere, but the transcription was detailed enough to make Elena's blood run cold as she read it. The message named her directly, described her habits with unsettling precision, and made clear that she had become a target, specifically because of her position as Marcus's mate. She sat in the quiet archive room for a long time after reading it, the pieces of the last 5 weeks finally falling into place. The declaration in the council hall, the nightly presence in her garden, the increased patrols. None of it had ever been about a broken bond at all. It had been about protecting her from a threat so serious that Marcus had chosen to sacrifice his own reputation, and hers, rather than risk her safety by telling her the truth. Her first instinct was anger, sharp and immediate, at having been kept in the dark for so long, while everyone around her, apparently including members of the pack far less important to Marcus than she was, had at least some awareness of what was happening. But as the anger settled, something more complicated took its place, a painful understanding of the impossible position Marcus had placed himself in, torn between protecting her and being honest with her, unable to fully manage both at once. She did not confront him immediately with what she had found. Instead, she carried the knowledge quietly for several days, watching him with new eyes, noticing details she had missed before, the way his gaze swept the tree line every time they stood together in the garden, the careful distance he maintained from her during daylight hours, as though he believed any visible affection between them might somehow signal to watching eyes that the broken bond was a lie. The exhaustion that had settled permanently into the lines of his face, the toll of weeks spent sleeping poorly on a shed floor, while carrying a secret heavy enough to break most men entirely. It was Grace who finally noticed the shift in Elena's demeanor, the careful watchfulness that had replaced her earlier confusion. The old healer found Elena in the garden one afternoon, tending to plants that had begun to wilt from neglect during the turmoil of the past weeks, and settled onto the bench beside her without invitation. "You know something now," Grace said simply, watching Elena's hands work through the soil with more force than the task required. Elena did not look up. I know enough to understand that I've been protected from something rather than punished by something. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Sometimes it's both, Grace said gently. A man who loves you enough to let you hate him for weeks, just to keep you breathing, is not a man who has stopped loving you, but that doesn't erase what those weeks cost you either. Elena finally looked up, meeting the healer's steady gaze. Do you know everything then? About Simon? About the threat? Grace's expression remained carefully neutral. I know enough to have guessed most of it on my own. Marcus has never been good at hiding pain from someone who's tended his wounds since he was a boy learning to walk on unsteady legs. But it is not my story to tell you, Elena. That belongs to him. He's not telling me anything, Elena said, frustration creeping back into her voice. He keeps asking me to trust him without giving me a single reason to. Then perhaps, Grace said, rising slowly from the bench, it's time you gave him a reason to trust you with the full truth, instead of waiting for him to decide you're ready for it. Elena thought about those words for the rest of the day, turning them over as she went about her duties, and by the time evening fell, she had made a decision. She was done waiting in the shadows of half-truths and careful silences. If Marcus was going to continue protecting her from a threat she now understood existed, then he was going to do it as her partner, rather than as a man carrying the entire weight alone in a cold garden shed, while she remained oblivious inside her own home. That night, when she heard the familiar creak of the garden gate, she did not wait for him to settle into the shed before making her presence known. She walked out into the darkness, wrapped in a warm shawl against the autumn chill, and found him standing near the wooden door, clearly startled by her sudden appearance. I know about Simon, she said, before he could offer any explanation for her unexpected presence. I know about the message he sent, naming me specifically. I know why you stood in that council hall and said what you said. Marcus went very still, his expression shifting rapidly through surprise, alarm, and finally something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight he had carried too long had finally found somewhere else to rest, even briefly. How did you find out? He asked quietly. That doesn't matter right now, Elena said, stepping closer despite the chill in the air. What matters is that you don't have to do this alone anymore. Whatever comes next, whatever Simon plans to do, I want to face it standing beside you, not locked safely away in ignorance while you exhaust yourself protecting me from a distance. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing at all, simply looking at her with an expression so raw and unguarded that Elena felt something in her chest tighten in response. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand, the first deliberate touch between them since the night in the council hall that had shattered everything they once had. I never stopped loving you, he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. Not for a single moment. Everything I said that night was a lie designed to keep you safe, and I am sorry, more sorry than I know how to properly express, for the pain it caused you. Elena felt tears gather in her eyes, but she did not let them fall, not yet. There was still too much left unresolved between them, too much distance still to close, but for the first time in 5 weeks, she felt something that resembled hope, taking root where only confusion and hurt had lived before. Then let's finish this together, she said quietly, whatever it takes. With the truth finally spoken between them, Marcus led Elena inside the cottage that night, and, for the first time since the council hall, told her everything from the beginning. He described the moment the courier arrived at the pack house gates, 3 days before his declaration, a young messenger with nervous eyes, who had clearly been warned of severe consequences if he failed to deliver the message exactly as instructed. He described unfolding the letter alone in his study, and reading words that named Elena's morning walking route through the eastern woods, her habit of visiting the northern market on the 2nd day of each week, details far too specific to be guessed at from a distance. Simon has always resented that our territory holds better hunting grounds and stronger trade routes than his own, Marcus explained, sitting across from Elena at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. For years, he has looked for a way to weaken our pack, without risking open conflict that might draw the attention of the wider Wolf Council. Targeting you seemed to him I believe, an efficient way to destabilize me personally, without ever setting a single wolf across our formal border. So you decided the answer was to convince him I meant nothing to you, Elena said, working through the logic slowly. If I wasn't your weakness anymore, I wasn't worth the effort of targeting. That was the theory, Marcus admitted. Though I confess, sitting here now, it feels like a far more foolish plan than it did in the middle of the night when I first thought of it. Elena studied him for a long moment. Foolish because it hurt me, or foolish because it didn't actually work? Marcus's expression grew troubled. Both, perhaps. The patrols have reported increased scouting activity along the border despite my declaration. If Simon believed the bond was truly broken, I would have expected his interest in you to fade rather than intensify. Instead, it seems to have done the opposite. The implications of that statement settled heavily over the kitchen table. If Simon had not been fooled by the public declaration, then the entire painful sacrifice of the past 5 weeks, the humiliation Elena had endured in front of the whole pack, the exhausting nights Marcus had spent hidden in the garden shed, might have accomplished nothing beyond causing them both unnecessary pain. Then we need a better plan, Elena said, her voice firm, despite the exhaustion evident beneath it. One that doesn't rely on convincing an enemy of something that clearly hasn't worked. Marcus looked at her with something like admiration mixed into his exhaustion. You're taking this remarkably well, considering I've just admitted the entire foundation of the last 5 weeks may have been unnecessary. I'm not taking it well, Elena corrected honestly. I'm choosing to focus on solving the problem in front of us instead of dwelling on what can't be changed. There will be time later to properly process everything that's happened. Right now, we have a more immediate concern. They spent the following hours mapping out possibilities, considering whether to bring the full council into their confidence, now that the secrecy had clearly failed to achieve its purpose, discussing whether an alliance with neighboring packs might discourage Simon from further aggression, weighing the risks of each option against the safety of the pack as a whole. By the time the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they had settled on a course of action that felt, if not certain, at least like genuine progress rather than another layer of secrecy. They would call an emergency council meeting, this time telling the full truth to the assembled pack members, rather than the carefully constructed lie that had caused so much unnecessary pain. Marcus would explain the threat from Simon in complete detail, and together, the pack would decide how best to respond, whether through strengthened defenses, diplomatic outreach to neighboring territories, or some combination of both approaches that no single person could determine alone. The decision brought with it a fresh kind of nervousness for Elena, who understood that reversing the public declaration would mean facing the same 40 pairs of eyes that had watched her walk out of the council hall 5 weeks earlier, this time witnessing a very different kind of vulnerability, as the true story finally came to light. But she also felt, for the first time since that terrible night, a sense of agency returning to her position, no longer a passive recipient of decisions made on her behalf, but an active participant in whatever came next. Daniel, informed of the plan early that morning, expressed immediate and enthusiastic relief that the secrecy would finally end. I've been carrying half of this alone for weeks, he admitted to Marcus, as they walked toward the council hall to arrange the emergency meeting. It will be good to have the whole pack's strength behind us, instead of just the 2 of us trying to manage a threat this size in the shadows. Grace, too, seemed unsurprised when word reached her of the planned announcement, offering only a knowing look toward Elena that suggested the old healer had anticipated this outcome long before either Marcus or Elena had fully worked their way toward it themselves. As the pack gathered that evening, summoned by messengers sent to every corner of the territory, Elena stood beside Marcus at the front of the hall, close enough this time that their shoulders nearly touched, a visible and deliberate contrast to the distance that had defined their last appearance in this same room. The murmur of confused speculation quieted as Marcus raised a hand for silence, and Elena felt her heart pounding as he began to speak, finally ready to tell the assembled pack the truth that had cost them both so much to keep hidden. 5 weeks ago, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the nervousness he could not fully hide, I stood in this hall and told all of you, and told Elena, that I had never loved her. That was a lie, and it is a lie I regret more than any decision I have made as your alpha. A wave of murmurs swept through the assembled pack, faces turning toward one another in confusion and surprise. Elena kept her eyes fixed forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, drawing strength from the warmth of Marcus's shoulder so close to hers. Marcus continued, laying out the threat from Simon in careful detail, describing the courier's message and the specific danger it represented to Elena's safety. He explained his reasoning, flawed as it had ultimately proven to be, and did not shy away from acknowledging the pain his choice had caused, both to Elena and to the pack members who had spent 5 weeks believing their Luna had been abandoned by a man who no longer valued her. The reaction in the hall was mixed. Some pack members nodded slowly, understanding the impossible position their alpha had found himself in. Others looked troubled, clearly uncomfortable with the idea that such a significant decision had been made and maintained without the full council's knowledge or input. A woman near the back, one of the pack's senior hunters named Ruth, rose to voice exactly this concern. With respect, Alpha, a threat of this magnitude should have come before this council the moment you received it. We are stronger together than any single wolf carrying a burden alone, however well-intentioned the secrecy might have been. Marcus accepted the criticism with a nod, offering no defense beyond acknowledging the truth of it. You are right, and it is a mistake I do not intend to repeat. That is precisely why we stand before you now, rather than continuing to manage this threat in isolation. The meeting stretched late into the evening as the council debated their response, weighing options for strengthened border patrols against the possibility of reaching out to neighboring packs for support against Simon's growing aggression. By the time the assembly finally dispersed, exhausted but united in purpose, a clear plan had taken shape, one that no longer relied on secrecy or sacrifice from any single member of the pack, but on the collective strength of everyone gathered in that hall. Elena felt something settle inside her as she watched the pack disperse, still processing everything that had unfolded, but grateful, deeply grateful, that the burden Marcus had carried alone for 5 weeks now belonged to all of them together. Several pack members approached her before leaving, offering quiet words of support, a hand on her shoulder from Hannah, a nod of solidarity from Daniel, a knowing smile from Grace that suggested the old healer had been right about more than just this single situation. That night, for the first time since the council hall 5 weeks earlier, Marcus did not walk toward the garden shed. Instead, he lingered at the cottage door, uncertain, waiting for some sign from Elena about whether the invitation from her injury still extended this far, whether the fragile trust they had rebuilt over the past days was strong enough to carry them past the threshold of her home permanently, rather than just for 3 nights of necessary care. Elena, watching him hesitate in the doorway, felt the weight of the decision settle over her. Trust, once broken as severely as theirs had been, did not repair itself instantly, simply because the truth had finally come to light. There was still healing required, conversations still needed, time still owed to processing everything that had happened, but standing there in the doorway, watching the man she loved wait so carefully for her permission, rather than assuming it, she understood that the foundation for that healing had already begun. "You can come in," she said quietly. "Not because everything is fixed. It isn't, not yet. But because I don't think either of us needs to keep proving something in a cold garden shed anymore." Marcus crossed the threshold slowly, as though afraid too sudden a movement might shatter the fragile offer she had extended. That night, he slept on the couch again, respecting the boundary that still existed between them, even as the largest obstacle, the secrecy that had defined their separation, had finally been dismantled. But the peace of that evening would prove short-lived. Within days, reports began arriving from the strengthened border patrols that suggested Simon's forces were no longer content merely to scout from a distance. The first sign of real trouble came 6 days after the emergency council meeting, when a patrol led by Daniel discovered fresh tracks crossing well inside their territory, far beyond the usual scouting distance Simon's wolves had maintained for weeks. The tracks belonged to at least 4 separate wolves, moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested deliberate testing of the pack's defenses, rather than simple curiosity. Daniel reported the finding to Marcus immediately, and the 2 men spent the following hours reviewing maps and adjusting patrol routes to close the gap the intruders had exploited. But the incident left everyone on edge, a clear signal that Simon had not been discouraged by the pack's strengthened unity, and might in fact have been provoked by it, viewing the emergency council meeting as a sign of vulnerability rather than resolve. Elena, now fully informed of every development, rather than kept in careful ignorance, found herself drawn into the planning sessions that had once excluded her entirely. She brought a perspective that surprised even Marcus, having spent years quietly observing pack politics from her position as Luna, without ever being asked to contribute her opinions directly. Now, sitting at the same table as Daniel and the senior council members, she offered insights about Simon's likely motivations, drawn from the tense negotiations she remembered from years earlier, that proved valuable to shaping their response. "He's not testing our defenses to find a weak point," Elena said during one such meeting, studying the map spread across the table. "He's testing our resolve. He wants to see how we respond to provocation before committing to anything larger. If we respond with restraint, he may interpret that as weakness. If we respond with overwhelming strength, he may interpret it as an opportunity to claim we started the aggression." Daniel nodded slowly, considering her words. "So what would you suggest instead?" "A measured response," Elena said. "Strong enough to make clear we will not be tested further without consequence, but controlled enough that we do not hand him a justification for escalating into open conflict." Marcus watched her across the table, with an expression that mixed pride and something softer, something that had been building steadily in the days since the truth had finally come between them. The woman offering strategic counsel to his counsel was the same woman who had once tended his wounds in a quiet kitchen, the same woman who had locked him out of her shed and then quietly left a way back in, and watching her step fully into the role she had always been capable of filling filled him with a quiet awe he had not expected to feel in the midst of such tension. The pack implemented Elena's suggested approach, strengthening the border with a visible but restrained show of force, wolves patrolling in coordinated groups rather than the isolated pairs that had allowed the earlier intrusion to go undetected for as long as it had. For several days, the strategy appeared to work, with no further reports of unauthorized crossings along the eastern border. Then, on a night thick with heavy rain that had been falling steadily since midday, a runner arrived at the pack house with urgent news. A group of wolves matching the description of Simon's pack had been spotted moving toward the northern market road, the very route Elena had once used for her weekly visits, before the increased patrols made such casual outings too risky to continue. Marcus received the news in the study, Elena beside him as had become their habit in these tense weeks, and felt his blood run cold at the implications. The northern market road was less defended than the main border, considered low priority because it saw so little traffic compared to the eastern approach, where most of Simon's earlier scouting had concentrated. "They're trying to draw our attention east while striking from the north," Marcus said grimly, already moving toward the door to gather what wolves he could assemble quickly. "Daniel, take half our strength to reinforce the northern road immediately. I'll follow with the rest as soon as I can organize them." Elena caught his arm before he could move past her, her grip firm despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I'm coming with you. Elena, this is exactly the kind of danger I've spent 5 weeks trying to keep you away from." "And in 5 weeks, that approach accomplished nothing except pain for both of us," she countered, her voice steady, despite the storm raging outside, and the greater storm building within the pack's borders. "I am not asking your permission, Marcus. I am telling you that I refuse to sit safely in this cottage while you and Daniel face whatever Simon is planning without me standing beside you." There was no time to argue further. Marcus, recognizing the same stubborn resolve that had once made him fall in love with her in the first place, nodded once, and pulled her along as he moved to gather the remaining wolves, the rain soaking through their clothes within moments of stepping outside, the darkness ahead offering no clear indication of exactly what awaited them on the northern road. The northern road, usually a quiet stretch of packed earth, winding between tall oaks toward the distant market town, had become a scene of tense confrontation by the time Marcus and Elena arrived, the rain hammering down around them in heavy sheets that made visibility difficult even for wolves whose senses far exceeded ordinary limits. Daniel and his group had already engaged a smaller force than expected, only 3 wolves, rather than the larger group the runner had originally reported, and something about that discrepancy nagged at Marcus, even as he moved to reinforce the confrontation. It was a trap, he realized too late, the true purpose of the Northern Road incident becoming clear only when a second, larger group emerged from the tree line behind them, cutting off the route back toward the pack house and effectively surrounding the smaller reinforcement group Marcus had brought with him. Among the wolves now blocking their retreat stood a figure Marcus recognized immediately, despite the darkness and rain, tall and composed even in the chaos, watching the unfolding confrontation with the calm satisfaction of a man whose plan had unfolded exactly as intended. "Simon." "Marcus," Simon called out, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the storm, dripping with false pleasantness that did nothing to disguise the calculation beneath it. "I confess, I did not expect the Luna to join you personally. I had heard rumors that the bond between you had broken entirely. Clearly those rumors were exaggerated." Elena felt Marcus stiffen beside her, and she understood immediately what was happening. The declaration in the council hall, the entire painful sacrifice of the past weeks, had been exposed as a lie the moment she stepped onto this battlefield beside him, visible proof to Simon and his followers that whatever story had circulated about a broken mate bond, the reality was very different. "You never believed the declaration in the first place," Marcus said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made Elena's skin prickle even through the cold rain. "That's why the scouting never stopped. You knew it was a lie from the beginning." Simon's expression carried something close to amusement. A man does not sleep in a garden shed for weeks on end to protect a woman he no longer loves. "Marcus, my scouts have been watching your movements far more closely than you realized. The declaration fooled your own pack, perhaps, but it never fooled me." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Everything Marcus had sacrificed, every night spent in cold discomfort, every moment of pain he had caused Elena through his silence, all of it exposed now as having accomplished nothing beyond weakening the very unity that might have protected them both from this exact confrontation. Elena felt a fresh wave of anger rise in her chest, not at Marcus this time, but at the man standing before them who had orchestrated so much unnecessary suffering purely to serve his own ambitions. "Then you should know," Elena said, stepping forward despite Marcus's instinctive hand rising to hold her back, "that whatever weakness you believed you saw in this pack was never real. You mistook love for vulnerability, Simon. That was always your mistake." Simon's calm expression flickered for just a moment, something like genuine surprise crossing his features at the sight of the Luna standing firm and unafraid, despite being surrounded on all sides by his forces. Bold words from a woman surrounded by wolves who could end this confrontation in moments. "Bold, perhaps," Elena agreed, meeting his gaze without flinching, despite the rain streaming down her face. "But not foolish. You forget that this pack has spent the last week reinforcing every approach into our territory, not just the eastern border where your earlier scouts concentrated. Even now, additional wolves are moving toward this exact location, alerted the moment the Northern Road confrontation began. It was a calculated risk, a bluff built on the strategic planning she had contributed to over the past days, and she watched carefully for any sign that Simon might see through it. For a long moment, tension hung thick in the rain-soaked air, every wolf on both sides poised and ready, waiting for some signal that would determine whether this confrontation ended in retreat or in violence neither pack could easily recover from. Then, from the darkness behind Daniel's position, the sound of additional wolves crashing through the underbrush reached every ear present, confirming Elena's bluff had, by fortunate coincidence, become true reinforcement, arriving exactly when needed. Simon's expression shifted, calculation replacing amusement, as he quickly reassessed the balance of power now shifting against him. "It seems," Simon said slowly, his gaze moving between Marcus and Elena with something that might have been grudging respect, "that I underestimated the strength of what stands between the two of you, in more ways than one." He gave a single sharp gesture, and his wolves began retreating into the tree line as quickly as they had appeared, melting back into the storm without further confrontation. Marcus watched them go, tension slowly draining from his shoulders as the immediate danger passed, though he understood clearly that this was likely only a temporary reprieve rather than a final resolution to the threat Simon represented. Elena, soaked through and shaking slightly now that the adrenaline of the confrontation had begun to fade, turned to find Marcus watching her with an expression of pure, unguarded emotion, all the careful control he had maintained for weeks finally breaking apart entirely. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotions he no longer bothered to hide. Standing there, facing him directly, when I have spent 9 weeks trying to keep exactly this kind of danger away from you. And you could have told me the truth 9 weeks ago, and let me decide for myself how much danger I was willing to face standing beside you. Elena countered, though her voice carried no anger now, only exhaustion, and something far gentler underneath it. We just proved, out here in the rain, that we are stronger facing this together than we ever were with you carrying it alone. Marcus closed the distance between them, rain streaming down both their faces, and for the first time since the council hall 9 weeks earlier, he said the words directly to her, rather than hiding behind careful strategy or protective silence. I love you, he said, his voice breaking on the words. I have never stopped loving you, not for a single moment of these 9 impossible weeks. I am sorry it took a confrontation in a storm for me to finally say it to your face, instead of leaving it folded up in a blanket in a garden shed. Elena felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks, 9 weeks of pain and confusion, and careful distance finally beginning to dissolve into something that felt, for the first time since that terrible night in the council hall, like genuine hope. Say it again, she whispered. Not because I doubt it now, because I want to hear it as many times as it takes to make up for the weeks I spent believing I would never hear it at all. I love you, Marcus said again, and this time, as he pulled her close, despite the rain and the wolves watching quietly nearby, respecting the private moment unfolding in the middle of what had nearly become a battlefield, the words finally felt like they were landing exactly where they belonged. The weeks following the confrontation on the northern road brought changes that rippled through every corner of the pack, though none more significant than the quiet transformation happening within the cottage at the edge of the territory. Simon, having witnessed firsthand the unity that now defined Marcus and Elena's pack, withdrew his forces entirely from the border, apparently recalculating the cost of further aggression against wolves, who had proven far less vulnerable than his intelligence had suggested. Reports from allied packs suggested he had turned his ambitions toward smaller, less defended territories instead, a problem for another day, but no longer the immediate threat that had shaped 9 difficult weeks of Marcus and Elena's lives. With the external danger finally settled, the two of them faced the quieter, more delicate work of rebuilding what had been broken between them. Elena had made clear from the start that love, freely and repeatedly spoken, would not by itself erase the pain of standing in that council hall and hearing him declare that he never loved her, nor the confusion of the weeks that followed. Marcus, to his credit, did not ask her to simply move past it. Instead, he committed himself to the slower work of earning back what his silence had cost, showing up consistently, answering every question she raised without deflection, and never again choosing to carry a burden alone when sharing it was the harder but more honest path. Grace, watching the couple's careful rebuilding from her position as the pack's quiet observer of all things, remarked once to Hannah that some bonds grew stronger for having been tested so severely, provided both people were willing to do the difficult work required afterward, rather than pretending the test had never happened. Elena took those words to heart, understanding that the goal was not to forget what those 9 weeks had cost her, but to build something afterward strong enough to hold that memory without breaking under its weight. The garden shed itself became, in an unexpected way, a quiet symbol of everything they had survived together. Rather than tearing it down, or simply returning it to its original purpose, as though nothing significant had happened within its walls, Elena suggested they leave it standing exactly as it was, tools and all, a small monument to the strange, uncomfortable, ultimately transformative chapter of their relationship. Marcus agreed readily, admitting that some part of him had grown fond of the small wooden building, despite every uncomfortable night spent on its hard floor, precisely because it represented the moment he had chosen, however imperfectly, to stay close to her, even when he believed he had no right to ask for anything more than proximity. On a clear evening nearly 2 months after the confrontation on the northern road, the pack gathered once more in the same council hall where everything had begun, though this time the mood carried none of the tension or confusion of that first terrible night. Marcus stood before the assembled wolves, Elena beside him without any careful distance between them, and spoke words that finally, fully closed the chapter that had opened 9 weeks earlier. 9 weeks ago, I told all of you a lie that caused more pain than I ever intended, believing it was the only way to protect someone I loved beyond measure," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying none of the strain that had marked his earlier address to this same room. "Tonight, I want to correct that lie in the clearest terms possible. I have loved Elena from the moment I first understood what love truly meant, and I will continue loving her for as long as I am given breath to do so. Whatever mistakes I made in trying to protect her, that truth was never once in question." The pack erupted into warm applause, a stark contrast to the confused silence that had followed his declaration 9 weeks earlier, and Elena felt the last remaining traces of doubt finally dissolve as she looked out at the faces of people who had watched her walk through the hardest weeks of her life, and had, in their own quiet ways, supported her through every step of it. Hannah's warm smile from the kitchen circle, Daniel's proud nod from beside Marcus, Grace's knowing expression that suggested she had believed in this outcome long before either Marcus or Elena had dared hope for it themselves. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and the pack house settled into peaceful quiet, Marcus and Elena walked together through the garden, past the small wooden shed that had witnessed so much of their difficult journey back toward each other. Elena paused at its door, running her fingers over the worn wood, remembering the folded blanket she had discovered there so many weeks earlier, the moment that had first cracked open the possibility that everything she believed about that terrible night in the council hall might not be the full story after all. 9 weeks, she said softly, looking up at Marcus in the moonlight. 9 weeks of sleeping out here in the cold, just to stay close enough to protect me. "I would do it again," Marcus said without hesitation, pulling her close against the evening chill. "Every uncomfortable night, every ache in my back from that hard floor, every moment of watching you from a distance, I created out of fear rather than choice. I would do all of it again, if it meant keeping you safe until I found a better way forward." "I'm glad you won't have to," Elena said, resting her head against his shoulder as they stood together in the quiet garden. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. No more shed, no more secrets. Just us, choosing honesty over protection, built on silence." Marcus pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, the two of them standing together in the peaceful moonlight, the small wooden shed behind them no longer a symbol of separation, but of survival, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal into something stronger than what existed before, provided two people were willing to do the difficult, patient work of finding their way back to each other, one honest step at a time.